Good morning and welcome to Safeguarding South Africa Environmental Law, Health and Justice Talk. My name is Soleto Siddiqui, and as the moderator of this event, I am delighted to have you all here, including the third year and honors students, lecturers and professors from NMU, and our esteemed guest speakers. Throughout the event, feel free to engage with the speakers and ask questions by typing them in the chat box, as I will be monitoring the chat box very closely and will incorporate your questions into the discussion during our designated Q&A session. Before we begin, let me take a moment to introduce our esteemed guest speakers. On the screen shade, we have Sharon Tessentov. She is a lecturer at the Nelson Mandela University and has a wealth of experience in teaching various economic subjects, including environmental economics. She has received the Golden Key International Honors Society Lecture of the Year Award for her teaching excellence. Tessentov has also supervised numerous postgrad treaties and has contributed to research in environmental economics, including her study on the willingness to pay for restoring indigenous vegetation in Underberg, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. We also have James Brand. He is an executive at ENS Africa, specializing in ESG, water law, renewable energy, and climate for over 11 years. Mr. Brand's unparalleled knowledge in these areas has positioned him as a leading advocate for sustainable development and environmental protection. We are also joined by Ms. Dorencia Pillay, a senior associate at ENS Africa, who has dedicated 8 years to specializing in environmental and mining regulatory law. Ms. Pillay's wealth of experience in this field has made her a trusted advisor to her clients seeking to navigate the complexities of environmental compliance with a particular focus in mining operations. Furthermore, we are fortunate to have Ms. Carlyn Davies. She is a consultant at ENS Africa with an impressive 14 years specialization in environmental and mining regulatory law. Her extensive background in this field has provided her with a deep understanding of the legal and regulatory framework surrounding environmental concerns within these industries. So therefore, it is safe to say that with their collective expertise, they will shed a light on how we can effectively balance the need for the development while safeguarding the environment and ensuring public health and social equity. Please join me as I warmly welcome Mr. James Brand, Ms. Dorencia Pillay, Ms. Carol Davies, and Sharon Tessentov.
Thank you so much, Soleto, and thank you to all of our participants who have joined us this morning. Without going into a lot of detail, let me start my presentation. As you've seen, our topic for today is Safeguarding South Africa, Navigating Environmental Laws, Health and Justice. So why do we care? This brief overview is going to give you an idea of where we're leading to today. I'm going to be focusing a little bit on the introduction and giving some idea of the urgency of the issues that cannot be overstated in terms of climate change and the impact that it has on everything, from the air that we breathe to the water that we drink. And in order to do that, we will be looking at the measures to protect the environment in South Africa, and I'll briefly introduce ENS Africa. Thereafter, we will be handing over to our panelists, and Soleto will be handling your questions towards the end. All right, so why this slide? Our journey towards improving our understanding of the urgency and interconnectedness of environmental challenges begins with this concept of planetary boundaries, a concept that was formulated in 2009 by a group of scientists. And that group of scientists was led by a gentleman known as Johan Rockström. Now, these scientists identified 9 processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system. And they proposed quantitative boundaries within which humanity can continue to develop and thrive for generations to come. But crossing these boundaries increases the risk of large-scale, abrupt, or irreversible environmental changes. Unfortunately, as of 2023, we have crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, including water use. Now, that, of course, is of particular relevance to the students and colleagues from the Nelson Mandela Bay area, because as recently as last year, we were facing day 0. So this overshoot emphasizes the need to reduce our impact on the environment and to create a more sustainable future for everyone. Turning to the Global Risks Report of 2023, it underscores the complexity of global risks and the necessity of preparedness and cooperation. Environmental and societal crises loom large in the coming decade, and they're driven by geopolitical and economic trends. Now, this report is highlighting the cost of living crisis as the most severe short-term global risk. It's noteworthy, however, that 6 risks in the top 10 in the next decade are all environmental. And that reflects our overshoot of the Earth's carrying capacity. And that's vividly illustrated in our next slide that focuses on something known as Earth Overshoot Day. Now, this Earth Overshoot Day marks the moment when our collective demand for natural resources surpasses the Earth's annual capacity to regenerate them. It's like withdrawing money from your bank account faster than you can deposit it. The problem is that in recent years, Earth Overshoot Day has been arriving earlier and earlier, indicating that we are using resources in an unsustainable manner. The information that I have now just shared with you seems to paint a picture of doom and gloom. So is there any hope? Well, we are going to shift our attention to the inspiring wave of environmental activism that has gripped South Africa to see that there is hope and the role that environmental law can play in that activism. So the passionate efforts of people from diverse backgrounds, they unite to address environmental issues. And this highlights the power of collective action in working towards a sustainable and equitable future for all South Africans. If we are looking at the image that we have on the top right of our screen, it's referring to something known as the so-called deadly air case. And that dealt with air pollution in the Highveld priority area, which extends from the eastern Gauteng across the Mpumalanga Highveld. And that's a recent example of this grassroots activism. People from diverse backgrounds joining forces to hold the government accountable. What else do we see? As many of the people joining us today are youth, young people. Remember, young people, is anybody younger than 35? Just by the way. So when we are looking at this picture, or these pictures that I have on the slide right now, we are looking at the images of Ayaka Melithafa and Ruby Sampson. They're prominent figures in the country's climate justice movement. Now, what is a very important, or what is extremely important for us in our discussion, is that Ayaka is advocating for climate change awareness. She's also looking at strategies to mitigate the effects of this climate change, acknowledging throughout her interactions with the media and such like, that while we are contributing the least to climate change, the global south are the ones who are going to be experiencing this effect in its absolute worst and devastating levels. So that's Ayaka. What about Ruby? Now, she engages in awareness campaigns, climate education, and protests. So it's important to note that environmental activism encompasses more than demonstrations and protests. It also includes education, advocacy, and collaboration. So as we carry on in our discussion and explore this nexus between environmental law and human health, this activism becomes a driving force for positive change and legal action to protect the environment and our human health. So to appreciate and to gain a deeper insight into the topics that our panelists will be discussing today, it's essential to understand the sources of environmental law in South Africa. And as we are going to notice from the slide that I'm going to share now, these sources are rather diverse. Starting with the idea of international law, we notice that South Africa is the responsible member of the international community, and as such is a signatory to numerous global environmental agreements. These international agreements play a very significant role in shaping our domestic legal framework. For example, when we are going to explore the link between environmental laws and human health, an agreement like the Basel Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous wastes and their disposal becomes relevant. But what happens when we are dealing with an environmental matter that isn't governed by legislation? Where do we turn then? In those cases, South African common law has a role to play. This common law is rooted in the 17th and 18th century Roman Dutch legal tradition. Now, principles like using your property in a way that doesn't harm another person becomes integral in understanding issues like pollution and its impact on human health. And then, of course, the Constitution. The Constitution is key to understanding both the evolution of South Africa's environmental law and policy and our legal framework's treatment of contested points. Of particular relevance is Section 24 of the Bill of Rights. And that section of the law says to us, everyone has the right to an environment that isn't harmful to their health or well-being. And those ideas are brought across in this very simple diagram, which is also going to lead us to statute law. You'll notice there that we are talking about NEMA. So The bulk of environmental law in South Africa is contained in various statutes and regulations. Laws like NEMA, this fantastic National Environmental Management Act, and the Water Act are highly relevant to us and to our discussion that is going to take place with our panelists. Now, NEMA is this law that gives effect to the environmental right that is enshrined in Section 24 of the Constitution. It provides the legal structure for managing and mitigating environmental impacts to protect our health. The Water Act, meanwhile, is providing the regulatory framework for ensuring the sustainable management and of our water and preserving its quality as well. Very important when we consider the impact of our gold mines and what has been going on in terms of the illegal dumping of toxic waste into our water supply. And then another law that I've just highlighted there is the National Environmental Management Act's relation to the Biodiversity Act. And it plays a pivotal role in preserving South Africa's unique natural heritage and ensuring responsible resource management. The last one that we have on our slide is customary law. Now, when we are thinking about this, it's referring to local customs that are related to resource management and how that could influence how communities approach environmental sustainability, especially in areas connected to strategic water sources. Whoops, too fast. Sorry, got a bit excited there. Now, in our exploration of South Africa's environmental challenges, it's important to recognize that these issues often extend far beyond our national boundaries. International agreements and conventions therefore play a crucial role in our response to global environmental challenges. I've highlighted a few of those agreements. Maybe I should start with the one at the bottom, the World Trade Organization, because it's not actually an environmental agreement, but it does play a role in shaping international trade policy. So then, in the context of sustainable fashion, which is going to form part of Carlyn's presentation, the World Trade Organization's rules relating to trade and sustainability are very relevant. Turning our attention to the Paris Agreement on climate change, that's guiding our domestic legal framework and commitments when it comes to climate policies and greenhouse gas emissions. In our discussion of environmental justice and modern challenges, this agreement is underscoring South Africa's commitment to sustainable environmental practices. And you've already heard me mentioning the Basel Convention on Hazardous Water. So let's transition to our panel discussion, where Suletu, our moderator, is going to facilitate a meaningful dialogue with our esteemed panelists, Carlyn, Dory, and James, who work in the Natural Resources and Environmental Department at ENS Africa. Now, ENS Africa is Africa's largest law firm, with over 600 practitioners and over 200 years of experience. So this firm is offering specialist legal and tax expertise through its range of offices, and it's no wonder, therefore, that it has this commitment also to the environment. I do wish to mention already that some insightful questions have been shared by our students at Nelson Mandela University, and Suletu is going to aim to address these when she directs those questions to the panelists. But there is going to be time at the end of our discussion to share your thoughts and questions with the panelists. And I would really like to encourage your active participation in this discussion, because understanding your own accountability and the compelling need for informed and deliberate action is key to effectively addressing challenges facing our environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon, for the beautiful presentation. We really appreciate it. All human beings depend on the environment in which we live in. A safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, and sanitation. So environmental issues have a direct link to human rights issues. In the context of extensive water, air, and ground pollution attributed to South African mines and other industries, Dory, can you briefly unpack what are the efforts that have been made by South African government and the industry to remediate and rehabilitate populated areas? And what is the impact on human life?
Thanks, Letu, and good morning, everyone. So, in the context of Africa as a whole, rapid urbanization is exerting increasing pressure on Africa's natural environment and its resources, which is negatively affecting its sustainability. Now, a rapidly urbanizing Africa degrades the environmental resources, especially in those urban areas. And for many African governments, they become locked into this grow dirty now, clean up later development path, which has irreparable, expensive, and wasteful impacts on the environment as well as the communities within those environments, and reduces the welfare of vulnerable groups. Now, there is a negative connotation on environmental rights and specifically human rights of vulnerable individuals and communities when it comes to health, food, water, and housing. In recent times, it's become very evident that there's a direct link between the extent of environmental laws in a specific country as well as the human health of citizens and communities within that country. In the South African context, for example, our environmental matters are highly regulated, with the country having an environmental right enshrined in our constitution, and a duty is placed on government to prevent this pollution, degradation, and secure ecologically sustainable development and the use of natural resources through reasonable legislative and other means. Our environmental law in South Africa is founded on sustainable development, which illustrates that environmental impacts are not prohibited, but there must be a balance between environmental protection as well as economic development, which is of paramount importance, especially in a developing country. As Sharon mentioned, NEMA sets the framework for the environmental management in the country, as well as for the specific environmental management acts, or SEMAs, which govern waste, water use, quality, air quality, biodiversity, coastal management, and protected or conservation areas. Our environmental laws impose a statutory environmental duty of care that must be observed in terms of the prevention and remediation of pollution and environmental degradation. Now, if we turn to our mines and water pollution, acid mine drainage, or AMD, is considered to be one of the most serious forms of pollution to the environment, particularly in South Africa, as one of our main sectors is the mining sector. Worldwide and in South Africa, AMD is largely attributable to the gold mining industry as well as the coal mining industry. And this affects both ground resources as well as water resources. Now, water pumping and treatment is normally conducted by these mines, before the water is released into the environment. But this is not always the case, especially when mines are abandoned or, a mining company is liquidated, for example, and there are no funds to rehabilitate the environment or the water underground. Now, the effects of mining activities in South Africa include the erosion to land and sinkholes, loss of biodiversity and conservation efforts, and contamination of soil, groundwater, and surface water, which is namely AMD. And mining can cause severe long-term damage to the environment, ecosystems, as well as water, soil, and air. It has dire consequences for the health and well-being of neighboring communities, and many of these communities have settled in and around mining towns or mining operations to find employment and to build up the socioeconomic development of those regions. Now, if we look at Mpumalanga, for example, as Sharon mentioned, it has high-yielding soils which are affected by coal mining, and this has a possible impact on future food security, for example. Mining is also sometimes permitted near or in protected areas, which could affect national parks, and reserves, which is of great concern. The mines of main concern in the country are gold and coal mines, especially the mines which are no longer being mined. In South Africa, I think it was the DMRE's 2010 report, it was estimated that over 6,000 mines had been abandoned and scattered across the country. Many of these mines were owned and operated by mining companies, which either abandoned their mines or were later liquidated. And these liabilities, so contaminated land, rehabilitation and remediation liabilities, have now reverted to the DMRE, which is responsible for the remediation and rehabilitation of these abandoned mines. And prior to 1994, the emphasis on mine liability and rehabilitation wasn't too onerous on mine owners and companies. Thus, they could, distance themselves from the contamination or pollution. But with the advent of NEMA and the National Water Act, for example, greater responsibility is placed on entities owning mines. The main act governing governing the mining industry in the country is the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, or the MPRDA. With that, NEMA and the National Water Act regulate how mining, water, and environmental activities are conducted, and in turn attempt to address the issue of AMD and other pollution or degradation. Now, it's of critical importance for mining companies to rehabilitate the negative environmental impacts of their mining activities. And in accordance with the polluter pays principle, which flows from Section 28 of NEMA, the duty of care, mining companies that cause damage to the environment during its operations lifespan must pay for such damage. The implications of the National Water Act are that mining companies are held responsible for the impact they have on water resources, even after certified mine closure from the DMRE. However, in practice, the DMRE is reluctant to issue closure certificates to mines until the environment has been rehabilitated and remediated. There's thus a long-term water management in place for mines, and they have a responsibility to ensure that even after closure of their activities, water resources are not negatively impacted. They need to take reasonable steps to prevent the pollution or degradation of the immediate and distant environment in which they operate. And in the event that they do not, the DMRE and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, or DFFE, can take legal action and recover costs from these polluting companies. The MPRDA also provides for closure objectives, especially during the initial planning stages of mining activities. So mines are required to determine the costs of the rehabilitation and remediation for whilst they operate the mine, as well as when they decommission, close off, and post-closure of the mine. And when they apply for a mining right or prospecting right, they need to set aside money to recover, to cover these remediation costs in the form of financial provisioning. The DFFE, as some of you may know, has introduced the financial provisioning regulations, which came out in 2015 and are applicable to new mining or rights holders and will be applicable to existing rights holders in and around February of next year. And these regulations provide that mining companies need to set aside funds for all costs associated with rehabilitation, decommissioning, and closure of these mines, as well as the residual and latent impacts. These funds are reviewed annually and are meant to be recorded in the annual reports of mining companies. What poses a problem is this trend where companies sometimes sell off their mines to smaller companies or junior mining companies, and there are extensive environmental responsibilities which these smaller mining companies are not able to fulfill. This leaves for abandoned mines, the possibility of abandoned mines, or the possibility that these smaller mining companies become insolvent because they're unable to fund their operations. A number of studies have also shown that government's efforts to manage AMD are compromised by various issues that tend to shift focus away from it. For example, environmental legislation that enables action to address the AMD problem has been found not to be effective in terms of enforcement due to the lack of capacity and resources of the DMRE, as well as current policies that govern mining and water usage, which become inadequate and unenforceable, or the DMRE is unable to enforce these provisions contained under NEMA, the National Water Act, and the MPRDA. And they can be easily abused by the mining entities, as well as entities which are perhaps politically connected or have other connections with regulatory authorities. There's also the case where mining operations have been abandoned with little or no provision for rehabilitation in the past, and these abandoned mines have dire consequences on human health, continuing consequences on human health. If we turn to other industries such as air polluting industries, now these companies impact on water, air, and ground pollution, and environmental activists have continuously stated that poor air quality in these areas is a violation of South Africa's constitutional rights and leads to the illness and death of many communities within those surrounding areas. Now, air pollution has adverse impacts and restriction on physical activity of persons in and around those areas. And if we consider recent case law, our courts have held that the consequences of poor air quality falls disproportionately on the shoulders of marginalized and vulnerable communities who bear the burden of disease caused by air pollution. Many of these sources of ambient air pollution include power plants, factories, incinerators, and busy roads, which are often located in poorer areas. And air pollution plagues these low-quality housing, informal and temporary settlements. Poverty also exacerbates the impact of air pollution as people have a lack of access to information, a limited access to affordable healthcare, and a lack of political power to demand remedial action. It's also a tough balancing act that our government has to pull off, in that we need to further economic development in the country whilst also protecting the basic human right of the citizens, particularly its right to a clean and healthy environment. And in recent years, we've seen more and more environmental interest groups holding companies accountable and instituting litigation to protect the rights and interests of vulnerable communities. So more and more companies are committing to compliance with the environmental laws to ensure that they do not fall short or wanting. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Soleto.
Thank you, Dori. I would like to stay on the topic water for a moment. Mr. James, can you briefly unpack how water use is regulated in South Africa, and given the importance of the strategic water sources, what legal protections are or should be in place to safeguard our water resources? And how do we balance the need for economic development with the need to protect our water resources?
Thank you, Soleto, and good morning, everybody. So I think it's important to first contextualize the importance of water and comment briefly on how little of it we actually have, both globally and here in South Africa. So as you know, we're known as the blue planet. If you zoom out to space, our planet is this blue marble spinning through the universe, and that's because 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. But of that 70%, just 2.5% is actually fresh water. And the interesting point about that is that only 1% of that is actually fresh water in our rivers, streams, and dams, with the balance being frozen at the poles or in the atmosphere or underground as groundwater. So the key takeaway here is that water is a very scarce commodity that's obviously critical for life on Earth. Locally in South Africa, some interesting pointers here just to bring home just how scarce water is. On a domestic level, we are recognized as the 29th driest country out of 193 countries, and we have less water per person than countries like Namibia and Botswana, who typically would be considered drier than our own. We receive half of what the rest of the world receives when it comes to rainfall, when it comes to global average, and our population is growing, and as a result, our Department of Water has predicted a water deficit. In other words, we won't have enough water for our economic and social needs by the year 2030, which is around the corner. So this is a real challenge, as water is important for a number of reasons. And I'd like to just focus and draw attention to two key reasons why water is so important. Firstly, it goes without saying that water is life, and we need it, and our ecosystems need it to survive. And as a result, as was mentioned earlier, we have this environmental right, but we also have a right enshrined in our constitution dealing with access to water. And it's recognized as a human right here in South Africa. And obviously, if there's a deficit, this has a potential to jeopardize the realization of that right. And the second key importance of water is that water is an economic enabler, just like electricity. So when you don't have electricity, it has an impact on your economy. Similarly, when you don't have water, it has a direct impact on the functioning of our economy, as all our sectors rely directly on water, whether that's energy for fossil fuel power generation facilities or industry, agribusiness, and mining. All these sectors rely on a steady supply of water. So if we don't have water, if there's a water deficit, there's a socioeconomic impact as well. This is part of a global problem. It's not constrained just to South Africa. Water scarcity is recognized as a global issue, and the link between water and the functioning of our global economy is also recognized. This week, some of you may have seen WWF published a report which commented that freshwater ecosystems are estimated to equate to approximately 60% of global GDP. So there's a direct link between water availability and the functioning of our global economy. So water, in summary, is important for all forms of life, and it's also a key economic enabler, which allows us to meet our socioeconomic goals and aspirations. So with that as a context, to answer your question, Soleto, how is water regulated in South Africa? Here there are two key acts or statutes which regulate water in South Africa. One of them was mentioned by Sharon earlier. That's the National Water Act, 36 of 1998. And what that does is regulate the direct abstraction or use of water from water resources like dams, rivers, and springs. It came into force in 1998 and gave rise to a complete paradigm shift in how water was treated in the country. Prior to this act coming into force, we had something called the Water Act of 1956, which allowed water to be taken if water was on your property, subject to the normal flow requirements. This shifted to a public trust doctrine in 1998, which effectively provided for a new system in terms of which water was held by the state as custodian on behalf of all South Africans. And if you wanted to use water by taking water from a river, stream, or dam or borehole above certain limits, you needed to apply to the Department of Water for a right to do so. So this was a complete shift in paradigm to how water was regulated in South Africa. The second key act which regulates water in South Africa, which I'd like to mention, is called the Water Services Act. And this provides for the regulation of the supply of water and sanitation services effectively by municipalities as per their competencies identified in the Constitution. So once municipalities have abstracted water from rivers, streams, and dams in terms of the National Water Act, which I mentioned, in terms of some kind of right or entitlement, they then reticulate that water for domestic consumption in terms of the Water Services Act. So those are the two key acts to keep in mind. So given how important our water resources are, what mechanisms do we have in our law to protect our key water source areas? And the interesting point here is that most of our water actually comes from a very small percentage of our land surface area, actually only 8%. And those areas are typically high catchment areas, which act as sponges. Our mountainous areas, particularly in the eastern part of our country near the escarpment there, where our highest rainfall takes place. And those catchments have been identified by the department, and we've mapped these. There are 22 of them. And there is there's an indication by our Minister of Environment that there's an intention to actually protect 11 of these 22 by at least 2025, which is around the corner, through a particular mechanism in Section 24 2A of NEMA, which is the act which Sharon mentioned earlier. It's important to protect these water factories for the country because, as Dorencia was mentioning, activities like mining, for example, have the ability to obviously pollute those resources. Things like overgrazing, agribusiness, plantations, and the like. All these competing land uses have the ability to sterilize these critically identified water source areas. But how we manage water is also hugely important, and having efficient and adequate water infrastructure is key, not only to avoid losing water through leaks and the like, but also to build water infrastructure in the form of desalination plants or water reuse facilities to increase the amount of water that we actually have in our supplies to avoid that water deficit by 2030 that's anticipated. In this regard, more than a third, approximately 35% of our water is currently lost through leakages as a result of inadequate maintenance of existing infrastructure, which is more or less the global average from what I could gather. So this is not a new thing or something specific to South Africa, but obviously upkeep and maintenance of infrastructure is a costly exercise. Similarly, rolling out a fleet of desalination plants or water reuse facilities is also a costly exercise. Our department recognizes this, and they have a detailed document called the Department of Water's Master Plan, which is available online, and they set out an acknowledged funding gap of approximately 33 billion rand per annum leading up to 2030, which we are going to need to plug if we are going to get the kind of infrastructure maintained that we do have, as well as the new infrastructure brought online to fend off this water deficit that we're anticipating. So one of the solutions to this, there are many, but one of the solutions is to bring on the private sector to assist with the financing that's going to be required. And in this regard, late last year, there was a publication of a draft National Water Resource Infrastructure Agency bill, which in essence seems to be suggesting that we may see the establishment of a new water infrastructure-focused SOE. And then similar to what we saw in the renewable energy sector with our Independent Power Producer Office, there's been mention of the establishment of a water partnership office. So we can potentially expect a pipeline of projects and private sector involvement to plug that financing gap to hopefully fend off the water deficit that I mentioned earlier. So Soleto, I think I'll leave it at that and happy to take questions towards the end of the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we can all agree that South Africa has a progressive constitution with an entrenched environmental right and multiple acts that regulate air, water, waste, and land use. And yet, the poorest communities are sometimes situated in the borders nearby polluting industries and do not enjoy these protections. Carlyn, Now I'd like to know, how are these communities' rights protected in a manner that delivers environmental justice so as to overcome the historical legacy of apartheid? Are there any gaps or areas that need improvement in the legal protection of environmental rights and the equal access to the constitutional environmental right? For an example, having laws in place and then having less access to street bins and trash cans, as well as having inefficient local communities, having inefficient local municipalities. Now the question is, are there laws there? Or is it a case that the laws are there, but they are just not enforced?
Thank you so much, Soletu, and good morning to everyone. I think this is such a fascinating question, and environmental justice in particular is focused ultimately on social transformation. And there's a lot of discourse and debate, particularly in this sort of area. It forms part of human rights, and ultimately social environmental justice really focuses on the fact that poor people often have to suffer the effects of environmental damage because of the greed of others. And that's based largely on, as you mentioned, systems like apartheid, colonialism, and currently at the moment, capitalism to a large extent. So I think my colleagues and Sharon have provided a really good baseline on the types of laws and legislation that we have, particularly in South Africa. And so I don't think that it's a gap in terms of an environmental right or the legislation. If anything, I think it is somewhat focused on education and awareness. And over my 14 years, I've definitely seen a growth in that area. So traditionally, when these environmental rights and the legislation came into operation, a lot of NGOs went to communities, particularly when there were things like mining rights applications or industrial areas, like mentioned by Dory, where there are air impacts or impacts on water. And a lot of the education was done by parties like NGOs and informed communities about their rights and often assisted them. And that's still happening today. So a lot of the awareness and the education is coming from NGOs, and often they're also funded from overseas companies, which I find quite interesting. So from a government perspective, I think our Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment is certainly doing its part as well to protect, but they obviously have a different role that they play, and that's more in actual applications when there is an issue with rights balancing for communities and, for example, a mining rights applicant. So it's quite a tricky mandate and balance that has to be done by the government officials. As you mentioned, municipalities are also understaffed, have little capacity, and don't necessarily have the means to provide the protection of environmental rights. So I think it's a really tricky area, and I don't think we've got it right yet. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And the gaps that I've seen, one that I've already mentioned on the education and awareness, most of the time when the education and awareness comes in is when it's almost too late, when communities are being faced by an impact on their environmental rights, on their health or well-being. So it's been a while since I've been in high school or primary school, so I'm not sure to what extent there are programs that educates our youth in particular on all of these environmental rights. But I think it's certainly something that needs to be done more, so that even the children, the youth, can share what they learn with their families, and hopefully that will better equip communities to support and protect their environmental rights. And then a second part, which you've alluded to, and which I think is also quite a difficult thing to grapple with, is the impacts of apartheid and colonialism, which we see in other countries. And that is all very much now a result is the way that that capitalism and the whole system is established. Obviously, with apartheid, communities were moved away from areas and put into different sections, and often taken away from their homelands, taken away from the environment that their ancestors had. And a connection with the land is obviously lost. And that I'll return to. I find it interesting that there's such a focus on sustainability, and as James mentioned, ESG, which is environmental social governance. And often Africa and the global south have already been practicing many sustainable practices. And now it's just kind of a hot topic. And so and later on, I'll discuss sort of technology, but I think ultimately Africa, to a large extent, has been practicing a lot of good sustainable practices, and we don't really need to change that. It's almost going back to how things were done. And an example of that as well, we've mentioned mining and the impacts that are related to that, and industrial areas as well. I wanted to, as Sharon alluded to, look at the fashion or clothing textiles industry. And this is something that really plays out globally as well. And it's interesting because when we think of clothing, we have to wear it every single day. And thanks to decades of marketing from the industry, we only really think about the end product, about wearing something, feeling good, and that's it. But it's actually a really dirty industry plagued by a very intricate supply chain that is filled with a lot of abuse on humans and on the environment. And with South Africa, what's interesting, just again linking to apartheid, we obviously had sanctions, and so our local industry supported itself, and it was fine to a large extent. But then in 1994, when sanctions dropped, we started getting textiles and clothing from overseas. And then in 2005, the World Trade Organization got rid of essentially a lot of mechanisms and prohibitions against textile and clothing, or massive amounts being imported and exported into countries. And as a result of that, the price of clothing went down, and South Africa again was flooded with a lot of cheap clothing, essentially. And that had a disastrous impact on our local industry, which is now, they've lost jobs, and it's not great from that perspective. But why the flooding of the market from overseas is bad, and why it ties again to capitalism, is essentially an issue with the fashion industry at the moment. The main one is overproduction and overconsumption. And it's something that I still struggle to understand, because Africa really doesn't have this type of mentality where the clothes are so cheap that people will buy them and just throw them away after a few uses, which makes no sense to me. But the reason that has happened is the global north has essentially just used all of their marketing tools and shifted a lot of the responsibility of production to the global south. So we see a lot of the garment workers are in the global south. They are paid really little. And the reason why they're paid little is because that's one cost that is that I suppose the business owners are able to lower, because you can't really, if you've got water costs, rent costs, that's what they are. But you can sort of play with the payment of workers. And so those costs are kept very low, which allows companies in the global north to buy masses, like large amounts of items, as cheap as possible per item, which then obviously fuels the overconsumption in the north. And then again, a further impact, well, one, even the workers are impacted, but then also the manner in which the clothes are produced. The easiest way to produce often is polyester. 60% of the clothes that we wear today are made from polyester, which essentially is oil, it's petroleum. And the chemical dyes that are used as well are often washed into local streams, into soil, wherever the textiles or the clothing is produced. So another impact on the global south. And then ultimately, when no one wants the clothes anymore, it is exported and sent to Africa. The Kantamanto market in Accra has historically been an incredible secondhand market where the locals resell items from overseas, and it's a very sustainable market. But now with the overproduction of clothes, making cheaper clothes with bad chemicals, I think it's about 40% of the items that they receive at the market now are sent straight to their landfills. They don't have any capacity to start with. And then the chemicals leach into soil and water. And so with this whole example, I just wanted to kind of illustrate that although we have environmental rights, we have environmental justice, whether it's in South Africa or globally, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. And often the systemic issues is the systems that are in place. And I know that Sharon is very passionate about this as well, because essentially capitalism hasn't served the global South. And this is a perfect example of how it hasn't. And the good news, so at least to end on something positive, is that there is a shift and a move, as was mentioned with James's speciality ESG, environmental social governance. There is a movement to provide financing through green bonds, impact financing that shifts the focus from profit just for profit's sake or for shareholders, and relying on the fact that stakeholders, whether it's employees, customers, they all have to benefit from the operation of businesses. And luckily, the EU are pushing quite hard, and this all links into their aim to get to neutrality, carbon neutrality in 2015, net zero. And one of the programs that they are focusing on is supply chain due diligences. And so companies are going to have to report on the workers that make their clothes in the global South and the impact on the environment. So although this system doesn't lend itself to environmental justice, there is a shift and there is a change. And I think the more people are aware of it and push for that change, I think we will hopefully see some environmental justice sort of coming through. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carlyn. I would like to give this opportunity to the floor. So you can now type your questions or comments. However, while you guys are still typing or writing your comments, I have this question for Dory. I'm very interested in this question. I just want to know, how does environmental law approach the tension between development and protection of the environment, as inevitably development will in some way degrade the environment? Is it through some kind of cost-benefit analysis, or how is sustainability achieved through our law?
That's a very interesting question, Soletu, and I think bringing it back to what I discussed earlier, it's definitely a balancing act. We have to balance our laws with the development of our country. You know, we're still reliant on non-renewable resources in this country. For example, our power generation is heavily based on coal. And, you know, we can't necessarily move to renewables immediately. So there's this move for a just energy transition, for example, where we need to take into account our development as a country, our economic development, as well as our socioeconomic development, uplifting communities, uplifting disadvantaged persons, you know, bringing economic activity to regions that don't necessarily have that influx of resources or wealth, but also enforcing and ensuring that we protect the rights of all our citizens, including the economic, the environmental, and their basic human health rights. So I would say it's a balancing act, and we just need to ensure that we bring everyone along on the journey on this transition. You know, we can't hold one above the other. We have to balance both. And I think that's a difficult task for our government, as well as many companies that are at the forefront of this, trying to balance everyone's rights and interests. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dory. That was an informative answer. I don't know now if I should continue with more questions. but I see here Sydney Mishi has said this is a very informative session. I think I will ask one more question to James, since Carlyn did mention something about ESG. So I thought I should ask this. The private sector also has a role to play in operating sustainably so as to not erode environmental base on which they depend for resources. Over the last years, we have seen increasingly more big corporate pushing a green or sustainable agenda. Why is this so? And how does it relate to the buzzword ESG? What does ESG mean? And why are corporates taking notes and adopting more sustainable practices? James, can you please take this one for me?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks for the question. The topic of ESG is a session on its own, but I'll try and be brief. I mean, so for those of you who have not come across the acronym, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And these are typically factors which have evolved and are taken into account by investors looking to place their funds with companies. Because there's a realization over time that if you fail to take these considerations into account, your investment may be subject to risks with an impact on profits. And this really, I think, is an evolution of the learnings from the 2008 financial crisis. So back in 2008, the financial sector was burnt by not fully understanding and not fully pricing and not having full disclosure on the subprime assets. And that shook the systemic fundamentals of our economy back in 2008. So seeing what might come on the horizon with climate change, with biodiversity collapse, with water scarcity, all the various topics we've been discussing today, the financial sector is wanting to learn from what happened in 2008 and really shine a light on these types of environmental situations, as well as the types of societal impacts which Carlyn mentioned, for example, in the textile industry. So it's an evolutionary thing. It's a buzzword at the moment. It has, in fact, been around for 20 years. It was coined, the ESG acronym was coined in 2004 by work done at the United Nations level by Paul Clements Hunt and his team. And in 2005, there was a report published by an international law firm, Freshfields, in 2005, which confirmed that directors of companies and institutions looking to place funds have a fiduciary duty to take into account these ESG type considerations. Typically, the financial system would just look at the financials of a company and it's a number crunching exercise. But this additional overlay of ESG considerations is becoming more mainstream because the relevance of it is becoming more understood. So in South Africa in 2011, again, so quite progressive. We had amendments to our Pension Funds Act, and Regulation 28 requires pension funds to take into account ESG considerations in placing investments in the underlying assets. And there's been a very interesting publication by our National Treasury recently, I think it was a year or two ago now, suggesting that requirement to take into ESG considerations is likely to expand beyond just the pension fund sector to the entire financial sector, including the banking system, among others. So just to give you an example, potentially to allow you to understand what I mean by saying that if ESG considerations are not taken into account, one could have an impact on the profits. So, for example, if you were investing in a company which had a fossil fuel-based production system that was giving rise to global greenhouse gas emissions, and if you didn't take into account the costs to your company as a result of a carbon tax, which is likely to ramp up over time, you may have an impact on what you projected to be your profit over time. So by failing to take into account that or failing to have that fully disclosed, you can repeat the same error we made in 2008 by not fully pricing these types of risks. And then similarly, the other part of the ESG inquiry, so it's inward looking at what the impacts may be on your profitability, but it's also understanding what your impacts are outside of the walls of your operations. So in that example, fully understanding what those emissions may be doing to your surrounding communities, which, Dory's spoken about, and understanding what those risks are. So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor of ESG. The question was, why are corporates taking this into account? It's obviously driven by the financial sector, as I've mentioned, because they have a vested interest in knowing whether or not these risks exist. But there's obviously a huge drive from a reputational point of view. Sharon mentioned that the youth is under the age of 35, and from what I see, there's a greater awareness in the younger ages coming through because they have the most at stake. So there's a lot of awareness now on the types of issues we're talking about today. And if you're a company and you're selling goods in the market and you have not got a coherent ESG strategy and you're not taking into account sustainability issues, you may be subject to reputational issues, which then have an impact on your market share. So that's another reason why companies are adopting ESG and more sustainability related practices. And then I think the third, so there's investment pressure, there's reputation, and I think the third is that it makes good economic sense too for your company. So if you, for example, understand what your water footprint is or what your greenhouse gas emission footprint is, it makes financial sense to reduce and be more efficient. So that if you are reducing your water footprint, you would not be paying as much as if you were using water as if it was an endless resource, because you get charged obviously by municipalities for the use of water, which is similar to the carbon tax type issue I mentioned with regard to your emissions. So it makes commercial sense, and there are cost savings in being more efficient when it comes to your use of natural resources. And then, there are studies out there which indicate that those companies that treat their workers, in accordance with applicable labor laws and UN standards, as well as having companies with adequate corporate governance systems in place, are going to be more sustainable over the long term, as opposed to companies that are cutting shortcuts. They may be profitable for a small period of time, but over the long term, those types of shortcuts are likely to catch up with them. So I think those are three drivers to mention, but yeah, happy to flesh out if there are any further questions.
All right, thank you, James. We have a question in the chat box. It is from Christopher Couture. He is saying, good morning. Ms. Davies has already touched on this. However, the state has a legal duty in terms of Section 24 of the Constitution to ensure that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being. However, we cannot rely on the government to ensure this. One must also take personal responsibility to ensure a clean environment. Unfortunately, not everyone has this in their mindset. Now the question is, how could one create a new culture for all South Africans to ensure that we all take responsibility to ensure the betterment of our environment? I think you can take this one, Ms. Davies.
Okay. Thank you. I was actually busy typing a response just in case we didn't have time, but I think it's quite a tricky question, just in terms of, in my opinion, and my colleagues can also give their thoughts. I think it links to behavior change and also, as I mentioned, just education from like a young age, from, small children learning to love the environment and know that they can protect it. And so it's not often something that's focused on. Also, the majority of our population who are in urban areas don't necessarily have the benefits of, living right next to a nature reserve or seeing the environment firsthand. And that's also an aspect of environmental justice that, sadly, the poor are often stuck next to industrial areas or mines and don't necessarily see the environment firsthand. However, that being said, I think with more natural disasters, the flooding we've had, the impacts of climate change are so much more evident. And so I think that really brings into focus, particularly for the youth, what the devastating impacts are if we don't protect our environment. So as James mentioned, and I fully agree that the youth are far more aware of what is going on, and sadly, a lot of the impact and the obligations will fall on the youth. So I think there is an opportunity for things to change, and particularly with things like social media, where information is just shared at a far more rapid rate, and it's far easier to sort of upskill and learn about things that you wouldn't necessarily have known sort of before the technological area. So I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with Carlyn. The only thing I would say is that it's all systems go type of approach and mindset that is required if we are to shift to the current trajectory that we're on in terms of our environmental issues. So I think the government obviously has a role to play, as Christopher mentions, in terms of setting the laws and then enforcing the laws, and that's the ambit of their realm in terms of their contribution. Then I think corporates, as we've mentioned, have a role to play. And I think the uptick of ESG is a huge step forward, and there's a lot of laws busy being developed in other countries and here locally too, as we shift from kind of soft law obligations to hard law obligations, and corporates have a role to play as well. And then the tier down, us individuals, we also have a role to play, although we are never going to necessarily affect systemic change, the kind of systemic change that is required. But we can play our own roles, and I agree with Carlyn. A lot of it is understanding the issue, and digging deeper and scratching the surface of the issue and fully understanding what the issues are. And I think once that's understood, you can potentially adapt and plug into initiatives that are being undertaken, and that there's opportunity through many sectors. It's not just environmental lawyers. There are a lot of sectors which have sustainability focused mechanisms which can be plugged into. So yeah, I guess the only contribution I wanted to add to what Carlyn said is to fully agree with her, and just to say, look, it's an all systems go type approach which can be tackled at different tiers of society.
I don't know if Dory is also going to say something, or I should carry on.
I'm happy just to add to that. So I think Carlyn and James have talked about it on a macro level, but on a micro level, Christopher, I think it also starts with us. And I know it sounds, you've probably heard it before, do as you preach. So it starts with just changing the culture around with your friends or family, employing methods and measures to ensure that we protect our environment. How many of us have, seen people litter or, and, not necessarily approach them to, educate them on how we protect our environment? How many of us buy from, as Colin mentioned, the fashion industry? How many of us buy from brands that aren't necessarily sustainable? And so I think it's just changing the mindset of those around us. And once we change their mindset, they can change, the mindset of their family and their friends. And it's that ripple effect. Everything starts in your own home, within your circle of friends. So on a micro level, I think, culture is both what we see outside, what government is doing, what companies are doing, but it's also what's happening in your own backyard or, in your friend groups. And that's, I think, one way of changing the culture and in ensuring we live up to our rights and, safeguard our future and the future of our generations that will come after us. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Dory. As we come to the end of this event, I would like to say we are honored to have you as our guest speakers today. We are very much sure, undoubtedly, know that your insights and contribution will help us enrich the discussion on safeguarding South Africa's environment, health, and justice. We are really grateful for the time that you've taken to have this talk with us. And now I will hand over to Sharon.
Good morning, colleagues, students, and our prestige guest. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Share Screen Africa for providing us with the platform for this exceptional online discussion. It's been an enlightening experience, and it's important to acknowledge the efforts that went into making this virtual event a success. I would also like to give a big thank you to our esteemed speakers, James, Dory, and Carlyn, from ENS Africa, for the time that they have given up in order to give us this online discussion. And also thank you for your expertise and valuable insights on the topics that was discussed today. And then lastly, I would just like to thank Ms. Sharon Tissendorf for making this event possible. Without her, this event wouldn't have been possible. She took it on herself to arrange this virtual event for MMU. Thank you everyone that participated.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was a wonderful and an insightful conversation. Thank you so much, and goodbye. Hope to see you in another discussion.